Thank you for everyone for being here. Thank you, Klaus, for hosting us. Thank you, Dina. For the next 45 minutes to an hour, I'm going to speak about a topic in the Arab-Israel conflict that is often overlooked, but is very important, and more than anything else, it relates to everybody here. So, because we're in Denmark, something very close to my heart, growing up, Lego was always my favorite toy because of the details. There was always these smaller pieces, there was details, and it was an important thing for me to learn to deal with and appreciate the details in every situation. And I'll let you know something, that these Lego figures are actually still on my screen at work today. In addition to Lego, my other passion, and a passion more for my son, is space travel. Like all good 12-year-olds, space, he wants to be an astronaut. And a couple of weeks ago, we woke up at 3 in the morning to watch the Israeli lunar orbiter be launched into space. Together with an American company, Israel launched a rocket that will eventually land on the moon on the 9th of April. On the 11th of April, an Israeli module will land on the moon, making Israel one of only 4 countries in the world that can land on the moon. And there are details there that also just fascinated me, but we'll get to that later. I want to now move backwards and explain where this talk, we're going to jump backwards to 1993. In 1993, the Oslo peace process officially began. And it began in earnest, publicly, with this famous picture of Prime Minister Rabin shaking hands with Yasser Arafat on the lawns of the White House, being welcomed by President Clinton. Leading up to this was what was called the Letters of Mutual Recognition, where the PLO officially recognized the State of Israel, and Israel recognized the PLO as the representatives of the Palestinian people. That was all that was needed to begin this process. Following this, we had the Oslo I, which created a Palestinian Authority, a nominal self-rule, and after that we had the Gaza and Jericho agreements and later agreements where the Palestinian Authority took over control in major Palestinian population centers. And then we had the Oslo II agreement, which was further Israeli withdrawals from major Palestinian towns, and the separation of the post-1967 area into areas A, B, and C. Area A was full Palestinian autonomy. Area B was Palestinian civil control and Israeli military control, and Area C was Israeli civil and military control. This was how the Oslo process began. Unfortunately, while there were glimmers of hope, peace also came at a significant price. Over the course of the peace process, there were significant bus bombings. Hundreds of Israelis were killed and injured. There was the infamous Goldstein massacre in Hebron, where Muslim worshippers were killed in Hebron. And the ultimate, from an Israeli perspective, was the assassination of Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin by an Israeli extremist. But while all this was going on, there was also a growing Israeli civil society, non-governmental organizations that were very active in political activities and pro-peace activities. Now, even before the beginning of the Oslo process, we had the emergence of some pro-peace organizations, Peace Now being the most prominent, Yesh Gvul, Gush Shalom. These were organizations that began pushing for certain types of peace activities. And at the same time, we also had the emergence of Israeli human rights groups that were initially not necessarily about a political solution one way or the other, but about promoting human rights in Israel and in the territories beyond 1967. But after the emergence of the Oslo process, we had many, many, many more pro-peace organizations coming to the forefront. But over the course of time, from the late 90s and the 2000s and onwards, we noticed that a trend became evident that the human rights organizations were receiving far larger budgets and far more media attention. So one of the first things our organization started doing is we started looking into the funding of these organizations. How is it that these same organizations, while their role is important, were receiving large amounts of money, and initially money that was regarded as secretive? And why do I say secretive? Well, this is a copy of a leaked protocol from the European Commission from funding that was given from the European Union to Israeli civil society in 1999. This document was only leaked in 2014. Until the late 2000s, funding that came from the European Union to civil society in Israel was regarded as a strategic imperative, and therefore the amounts of money and the decision-making process on how that money was given to civil society was secretive. I'm going to say that again. The amounts of money and who got money from the European Union to civil society organizations in Israel was not made public. And in some cases, that was also true for other European countries, including Denmark, where the amounts of money and who received money was not made public. And when we looked at this document, we can understand why some of that information may not have been well received. In 1999, one of the most well-known organizations was an Israeli organization called Four Mothers. Four Mothers was established by four mothers whose sons had died in southern Lebanon in 1996. Israel, between 1982 and 2000, had occupied southern Lebanon and declared a self-declared security zone. And the result was that many Israeli soldiers were killed in the ongoing fighting in the area. The Four Mothers established their own organization with the express role of removing Israelis from southern Lebanon. Now, they were receiving large media attention, and many Israelis began agreeing with the idea of removing Israelis from southern Lebanon. But at the same time, they were also receiving, unbeknownst to anyone, nearly €250,000 from the European Union, specifically to educate the Israeli public to leave Lebanon in peace. Now again, they were established for this role, but this is a large amount of money for an organization that was initially kept secret. And then we have other organizations, for example, the Religious Women for Peace, who were receiving, again, €250,000 specifically to promote peace within the within radical Jewish settlers, who were seen as an organization that was clearly not necessarily pro the current peace process. But then, when we looked at other organizations, again, in the same memo, we see a slightly different picture emerging. For example, Peace Now, one of Israel's first peace organizations that was pushing initially for peace with Egypt, and now is very active in pushing for a peaceful solution. They received money from the European Union for outreach to immigrants from the former Soviet Union, a social group that traditionally has anti-peace views and votes Likud. Likud is the Israeli right-wing party. The two major parties in Israel until recently was Likud on the right and the Labour on the left. Now, unfortunately, the Labour is much smaller, and there are many other parties. But here we have information that the European Union was specifically targeting a group because they knew they voted for the right. Now, beyond the idea of voting right and voting left, the European Union is acknowledging in this secret memo that they were targeting a specific group to change their political point of view. And then we looked at another organization that was even more blatant, The 1999 election that took place in Israel was between the current Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Likud and Ehud Barak, a former general who was at the time the head of the Labour Party. And during the election in 1999, an organization was funded by the EU specifically to consolidate Russian immigrant voting for Barak. Now, again, beyond the idea of right and left, the European Union is acknowledging that they were giving money to civil society organizations with the express purpose of changing a political point of view and voting for a specific candidate. In 1999, Ehud Barak won the election, and there was a final push for a peace process. In Camp David, Ehud Barak, who was the newly elected Prime Minister of Israel, who was elected specifically on a peace platform, Bill Clinton, who was fresh off the Monica Lewinsky high, and Chairman Arafat met at Camp David with the idea of coming to a final peace agreement. The result was anything but. Soon after the failure of the Camp David attempt for peace, there was a massive outbreak of violence. Today it is often referred to as the Second Intifada, where the Israeli public was once again exposed to massive amounts of violence, bus bombings. The Israeli army re-entered many Palestinian cities. We have these infamous images of the renewed violence on both sides. But then we had a massive shift in Israeli civil society and in Palestinian civil society. And from 1999 until today, we had quite literally hundreds of Israeli organizations that came about. This is just a small example of Israeli organizations on both sides of the political divide that now came about. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of politically active Israeli organizations that were involved in politics and or human rights that emerged after 2000 until today. This is just a small sample. There are hundreds of them. So Israeli civil society became very active, and many, many, many organizations were established for a variety of different human rights goals following the 2000 violence. Internationally, though, another event was taking place. In 2001, the United Nations held its conference against racism and xenophobia, appropriately held in Durban, South Africa. The symbolism being that Durban, South Africa, post-apartheid, was the right place for a UN conference that would deal with racism and xenophobia. Unfortunately, this conference was anything but a conference that dealt with racism and xenophobia. The result was that this conference became an anti-Israel hate fest, and in some cases, a festival that displayed blatant anti-Semitism. This is just some of the examples. So rather than being a UN-sponsored event that dealt with racism, hate, xenophobia, the entire conference focused all of its energy on anti-Israel messaging. And in essence, this is the beginning of the International Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions Campaign against Israel, or BDS. And why is this often referred to as the beginning of BDS? Well, parallel to the International UN Forum, the UN conference, there was an NGO forum where human rights NGOs from around the world, the largest human rights organizations like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, to many of the Israeli organizations, to dozens of others, were holding a symposium with the UN on racism and human rights. But again, rather than deal with racism and violence against minorities, the forum came up with this language where they openly referred to Israel as a racist state, compared Israel to apartheid South Africa, and began calling for sanctions and embargoes against Israel, and in the same vein as embargoes and sanctions against apartheid South Africa. And it's no surprise that this same language was then adopted in 2005 by Palestinian NGOs, by Palestinian civil societies. The dozens, if not hundreds, of Palestinian human rights groups all banded together and put out the first call, the official launching of the BDS movement. The official launch of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement against Israel came from Palestinian civil society, calling for institutional boycotts of Israel, sanctions of Israeli companies, and divestment from Israel. This was done primarily by the Palestinian NGOs and civil society. And still today, when people refer to the BDS movement, they will say, well, it started because of Palestinian NGOs. Most of those Palestinian NGOs, like their Israeli counterparts, were receiving massive amounts of support from the European Union and European governments, including Denmark. We call this a Durban Strategy. The idea is to make human rights the new weapon to be used against Israel. And how does it work? BDS is fed into the NGOs, the civil society organizations, and then it goes to the media, to members of parliament, to foreign ministries, and into academia. But they will not use the language of BDS. They don't say we're anti-Israel, we want to destroy the state of Israel, we want to embargo the state of Israel. No, no, no. It's not BDS. It's a human rights issue. So political anti-Israel organizations have now manipulated their language and they're now supporting human rights. It doesn't matter what happens. They're calling for the end of the Jewish state as a human rights issue. They're calling for the boycott of Israel only, but it's a human rights issue. They're calling for the sanctions of Israel only because it's a human rights issue. And that is when our organization was founded. Following this outrageous conference, our founder, Professor Steinberg, began as an academic looking into the power of the human rights network. And initially, he started studying it as an academic. Now, 16 years later, we have our organization. We're an independent research organization. We have a database of 150, actually now nearly 200 non-governmental organizations that focus on human rights internationally and are active in the Arab-Israel conflict. And our primary role is to provide information and promote accountability. Because until then, believe it or not, something that we found phenomenal was that nobody ever questioned the role of human rights organizations. Now, human rights is one of the most important aspects of our modern society. The reason we have developed and progressed into a progressive society is because we actually care about human rights and minority rights, women's rights. These are the things that make us a great modern society. But just saying that you're a human rights organization doesn't mean that you are immune to criticism. And one of the things we noticed is that human rights groups were assuming that they were above any type of criticism. Now, I think healthy skepticism, criticism, whether it's a government, whether it's an organization, whether it's a charity, that is also a vital part of democracy. But why is it, and this was an interesting question, that the minute an organization labeled itself as a human rights group, any criticism of it was not accepted? So, in addition to looking at the details and activities of human rights groups, we also looked at funding. And today, one of the interesting aspects that we look at is just from within Europe, from the European Union and various European countries, we're looking at over 100 million euro that go to politically active non-governmental organizations in Israel and the Palestinian Authority. 100 million euro that goes to these organizations every year. And now I'm going to ask a question that I'm going to repeat over the course of the next few minutes. 100 million euro a year goes to improving human rights in Israel and the Palestinian Authority. Has there been a 100 million euro improvement every year? Have human rights improved by 100 million euro a year? In almost any other industry, when we look at this, That's a significant question. The development policy of a country like Denmark, Norway, anywhere in the world, it's a major part of foreign policy, and I understand why it needs to be done. But when you invest in development of education in foreign countries, development of sanitation in foreign countries, of healthcare, you see results. You invest in education, you can build schools, you can train teachers. After years, you will see children emerge with a higher level of education. When you invest in healthcare, the general health of a population will increase. You will see doctors being trained. You will see healthcare professionals being trained. There's more medical equipment. You can see tangible results. And if those things do not happen, the answer isn't, well, just throw more money at the problem. The answer is, well, maybe the organizations that are receiving the money or the way we're doing it has a problem. And the point is that the people in charge of development aid will look into this in detail and adjust based on the lack of results, or continue based on good results. But in human rights, we don't have any of that. We can't say that it's improved, but if we can't say it's improved, we can't say there's been no progress. And if you can't say there's been no progress, well, we'll just keep throwing money at the problem year after year after year. We'll keep giving more and more money to the same organizations, regardless of improvements, because we'll just keep funding human rights. We look at two aspects of funding, two ways that organizations receive funding. The first is direct funding. This is money that will come directly from a government, from the Danish Foreign Ministry or the European Commission, directly from a country, from a government to an organization in our region. The second is indirect funding. And that is when money goes from the government to an intermediary. In this case, it could be Dan Church Aid, Folkekirke Nordhelp. Excuse me if I've butchered the pronunciation. And then the Dan Church Aid will then give money to an NGO in our region. That we call indirect funding, but it's still, much of that will start off at the government level. So let's look at some of the extreme examples of NGOs that have been receiving money until a few months ago, until a year ago from Denmark. Denmark, together with Switzerland, Sweden, and Holland, had set up a pool called the Human Rights Secretariat, and this secretariat was responsible for giving out Danish money to NGOs. One of the organizations was a Palestinian organization called Badil. Badil is a Palestinian organization that was set up specifically to promote the issue of Palestinian refugees. And according to the organizations itself, its goal is to create a de-Zionized Palestine of a single state. In addition to supporting BDS, being one of the founding Palestinian NGOs that signed the Palestinian Manifest in 2005, every year Badil has a cartoon competition where they encourage Palestinians to express themselves and the right of return. So this first cartoon from 2010, which I don't think leaves any room for interpretation, whether it's on the line of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, this cartoon was condemned around the world. But that didn't stop Badil from receiving more and more money from Denmark and other countries. This is an example of a cartoon from 2 years ago, and this cartoon from 2017 is a Palestinian ripping up the Balfour Declaration. Now, this organization received $600,000 from the Secretariat, from the Danish government, but at the same time, they continued to receive 300,000 crown a year from Dan Church Aid. Let's look at another example, the Palestinian Center for Human Rights. Again, an organization that claims to be a human rights organization. It sits in Gaza. One of the interesting aspects that many countries are taking up right now is the issue of Palestinian prisoners. Under Palestinian law, if a Palestinian has killed or wounded an Israeli and he sits in an Israeli prison, he receives a pension from the Palestinian Authority. And the pension from the Palestinian Authority is specifically correlated to the severity of the crime. If a Palestinian murders 2 Israelis and he is sentenced for 2 murders, he receives a large salary. If he kills and wounds 3 or more, it's an even larger salary. And the more severe the crime, the more money he actually gets as a pension from the Palestinian Authority. Now, there's been a lot of debate, and many countries, including the Danish government, has condemned this, and there's been much debate about how to stop the Palestinian government from pushing funds towards funding Palestinian terrorists. But when the Palestinian Authority held their own debate on this, again, it was shut down very quickly. One of the organizations that were in favor was the Palestinian Center for Human Rights, because they're a Palestinian human rights organization. But they said that if you suspend prisoners' salaries, it's illegal, immoral, it violates basic law, and it violates international human rights. So, according to a Danish-funded human rights group, if you don't pay Palestinian prisoners based on the severity of their crimes, that is a human rights violation. In addition to being a supporter of BDS, the Palestinian Center for Human Rights are also very much involved in attempts to try Israelis at the International Criminal Court in The Hague. Now, just to give you an idea, here's a screenshot I took of their website just a few weeks ago. Among their funders is Dan Church Aid and the Human Rights International Law Secretary. That was funded by Denmark. In Israel, as I showed you before, we have a very large and diverse civil society. We have thousands of charities, NGOs, civil societies that are politically active on all aspects and on all extremes. One of them is an Israeli human rights organization called B'Tselem. B'Tselem is run currently by a man by the name of Chagai Elad. And Chagai Elad recently spoke at the United Nations. He was invited by the United Nations as a member of Israeli civil society. Now, I may have many disagreements with Mr. Elad and his organization, but the United Nations invited him as a member of Israeli civil society. And the Danish government funds B'Tselem as an Israeli civil society organization. But here he is sitting next to the representative of the Palestinian state, not of Israel. So when the Danish government and Dan Church are giving all this money to B'Tselem, are they funding them as a member of Israeli civil society or as a human rights group? And if they're funding them as a member of Israeli civil society, well, are they really a representative of Israeli civil society? And if you're funding them as a human rights group, what have they achieved? So what could be done differently? How have governments, including specifically now, let's look at what the Danish government has done differently over the years. We started with individual funding. Denmark, the European Union, and other governments would give money directly to NGOs, exactly like we spoke about. But then in 2012, 2010, 11, and 12, the idea was to create a pool, get a couple of countries together and create a management system that would then fund different organizations. So one of the first of these was a management system called the NGO Development Center. The idea was to get NGOs together to develop their policies together to be funded from the top by governments. The theory was great, except that the NGO Development Center in the Palestinian Authority came up with this. They called the Palestinian NGO Code of Conduct, the way NGOs need to work. So we have work about transparency, about being honest. But one of the things they were also told is, if you're a Palestinian NGO, you need to reject any normalization of activities with the occupier, neither political, security, cultural, or development. So at the very outset, in this case, the Danish government was responsible for funding organizations who said one of their core values is reject any interaction with Israel. That needs to be, before you do anything else, if you want to be a member of the Palestinian NGO network, you need to reject any type of activity with Israel. So we've seen how funding moved from peace to human rights, but now we've moved to such an extreme that any type of interaction is regarded as out of the question. So the funding to the NGO Development Center was stopped, and a new pooled mechanism was started. As I'd mentioned before, the idea of this Human Rights and International Law Secretariat, where Denmark joined with other countries and put together a new pool of funding to NGOs. The problem was the organizations that were receiving money here were also problematic. And this is an event that started major change in Denmark. One of the organizations funded by Denmark through the Secretariat was the Women's Affairs Technical Committee. Now, it sounds like a very good organization. You're dealing with women's affairs in the Palestinian Authority. In addition to the fact that this is an organization that accused Israel of apartheid and ethnic cleansing, in May 2017, this organization opened a women's center for young women named after Dalal Mughrabi. Dalal Mughrabi was a terrorist who in 1987 led an attack that killed 37 Israelis, including 12 children. Using Danish funding, or a Danish-supported organization, decided to this was the appropriate name to give to a women's center. This is when major changes started to take place here in Denmark. In addition to the organizations, and there's many more examples of organizations that are highly problematic, there was also a problem with the management of these pooled fundings. And here's an example. The management of the Human Rights Secretariat, just the management before the money even gets to NGOs, were receiving enormous salaries. For example, the director of the management company that was giving out money to NGOs was receiving a monthly salary of $10,000. Just a manager of a fund that gives out Danish funding was receiving $10,000 a month. Now, the question to the foreign ministry, whether it's in Denmark or everywhere else, is, were you aware of this? Did you know that these organizations had been naming centers after terrorists? Did you know that there were these exorbitant funds? Did you know that many of these organizations openly reject peace, reject the idea of a two-state solution? And if the answer is yes, the foreign ministry was aware of this, so then why are you giving these organizations money? And if the answer is no, the foreign ministry was unaware of this, well, then what type of evaluation process are you doing? And that goes back to what I said before. Why are we giving so much money to these organizations? And we shouldn't be surprised where we're throwing so much money and nothing is being achieved. But there are other issues that need to be looked at by the foreign ministry. The first is what we call general funding versus project funding. This is something that has been an ongoing debate across the world, is when you fund an organization, when you give somebody money, do you give the organization money or do you give money for a particular project? And the answer very often was, well, we give money for a project. Just because a particular organization may be against peace, a particular organization may be in favor of boycotting Israel, this particular organization says there should be no support or interaction with Israel, but they've got a very good human rights program, so we'll give money to that human rights program. That is project funding, and that is the way many foreign ministries in Europe work. They say, well, that organization may do many things we disagree with, but we can give them this amount of money for human rights. That's how project funding works. The problem with that is what we call traceability versus interchangeability. Once you sign a check for an organization, how are you able to know that that is exactly where the funding is going? An organization needs to pay salaries. They need to pay to keep the lights on. how are you 100% sure that your money will only go to your particular project? And like I keep saying before, where does the money really go? So now that I've drawn a mental picture of how it all works, I'm going to give you a quick idea of some of the other problems and issues that we see and why sometimes foreign policies are the way they are. So we've said that we have Danish funding to Folkekirke Nordhelp, and that goes to NGOs, but we also have direct Danish funding to NGOs. Okay, some of those NGOs support BDS. Not all of them, some of them support BDS. But we've already said that all of the NGOs, whether they support BDS or not, don't speak about BDS, they speak about their human rights organizations, right? Israeli violations particularly. These NGOs are now used by the government as consultants on human rights issues because they're the experts. We gave them money so that we can consult with them about human rights issues. And once you're consulting with them about human rights issues, what is invariably going to be their recommendation? Give more money to human rights groups. And then you consult with the human rights groups about what to do, and their recommendation is clearly going to be, give more money to human rights groups. And once you're giving more money to human rights groups, and this circle continues, that invariably will become part of national policy. Nobody thinks about the fact that how does this echo chamber continue? And I'm going to give you an example. Whenever we have a citywide project or a government project or even a private project of massive proportion, you are building a bridge in a particular area, you're building a road in a particular area. In order to get the best road built, you will hire an external consultant who will speak to you about the geology, how to build a bridge, the materials that need to be used in this particular bridge. And then a committee will decide on the best course of action, and invariably then they will put out a tender for different companies to build the bridge in the best way. What's the pricing going to be? How will they build it? And the committee will then choose a company based on those criteria. But when you're building your bridge, that first company, that very first geology company or recommendation company would never be allowed to be part of the tender process for building the bridge because that's a clear conflict of interests. In the human rights world, however, that is not only the way it works, it's the accepted policy. Because the human rights organizations are the ones who are consulted, and they're the ones who then receive funding to continue human rights work. Now, until now there's been bad news, but there have been very many positive developments around the world and in Denmark. I think that we need to start off by saying the human rights strategy and paying for the development of human rights organizations, whether I may disagree with the activities and work of certain organizations, I very much understand and agree with the idea of funding human rights groups. So here in Denmark, after the Women's Affairs Technical Committee, your foreign minister put out a new investigation, and the result of the investigation in December 2017 was new criteria for the funding of NGOs in Israel and the Palestinian Authority. And these criteria in no way hamper the work of human rights groups. In fact, they make the government more accountable to its citizens and the organizations more accountable to Danish funding. And when you look at these 5 new criteria that came out from Denmark, I have to say 2 things. One is they should be self-evident. And second, as Danes, you should all be very proud of what the current government is doing because these are criteria that I think much of the world should copy. It doesn't hamper human rights groups in any way. It improves accountability and responsibility. And I think if you look at some of these examples, you can understand. Refrain from discrimination and incitement. Well, clearly, yes, if you're a human rights group, you should naturally refrain from discrimination and incitement to violence. Promote human rights exclusively through non-violent means. Again, this is not saying that human rights groups can't get funding and can't work. It's very important. But if you're a human rights group, you can't support violence. That should be self-evident. We've seen many cases of human rights groups that employ members of various terrorist organizations. Well, Danish criteria makes it very clear. If a member of a EU-registered terrorist organization is in your organization, you cannot get money. Again, pretty self-evident. You are a member of a registered terrorist organization and you work for that organization should no longer be allowed to receive funding. No Danish funding for BDS activities. And finally, something that again should be self-evident is Denmark, across the current political government and previous, has always supported a negotiated two-state solution. Now, we can debate that forever. What does it mean? Which right-wing, left-wing territories, settlements? But that is Danish policy. Support a negotiated two-state solution. Clearly, you should only be then giving money to organizations that only support your policy. It makes no sense to support a civil society that is encouraging people to act against your own interests. Now, after all of this, and we're nearly done, there are still going to be many challenges. And we've seen it before. We spoke about hundreds of millions of euro that goes to civil society in Israel and the Palestinian Authority. So the question is, when civil society and non-governmental organizations are receiving huge amounts of funding from foreign governments, do they still represent civil society? Are they still non-governmental organizations? And once you're putting in so much money to democracy, to peace, to human rights, and the situation hasn't improved, why is the money still going? Why are there no changes being made to improve the situation? And finally, there is the question of anti-Semitism. Unfortunately, around the world, but particularly in Europe, anti-Semitism is returning. But we're faced with a major challenge, especially in Europe, in that there doesn't seem to be a way to define anti-Semitism. So everyone is adamant about the need to fight anti-Semitism, but nobody seems to know what anti-Semitism is. So one of the examples is what's called the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition of anti-Semitism. Now, this working definition of anti-Semitism has what they call contemporary examples of anti-Semitism. And among the examples is denying the Jewish people the right to self-determination, calling for the destruction of the State of Israel, applying a double standard to Israel, where you say that a certain standard of law and rights applies to everyone else, but Israel should have a different standard. Israel should be held accountable for a different type of activity. And using symbols and images associated with classic anti-Semitism, as we've seen before, we have human rights organizations that have no problem with a Jew with a black hat and sidelocks standing on a bloodied Palestinian. And finally, Nazi imagery, which we've seen over and over again being used to associate Israel. So how do we move forward? What are our recommendations? Well, first and foremost, I would say, again, Denmark is a shining example. They have not hampered the work of human rights groups, but they've encouraged accountability. But more so, we also need full transparency, not only on the funding, but on the decision-making process that leads to funding. How are the same organizations being funded? What are the process that allow these organizations to be funded over and over again? Increased coordination between governments. Israel, Denmark, the European Union, we're all governments that work together. Despite many differences, I'd imagine that our governments all want what's best for each other's citizens. I think more cooperation instead of less cooperation would be the way to go. And I need to point this out. I think there should be, we're very adamant about the fact that government legislation against NGO activities is a problem. Coordination is far better than legislation. Duplicate funding. Why is it that, using the Danish example, Denmark has said certain organizations should not contravene Danish criteria and should not be receiving Danish funding, yet those same organizations are still receiving funding from Dan Church Aid? And even more so, if Denmark is already giving money to a particular organization, why are they getting additional funding from Dan Church Aid? Surely there is no lack of organizations, no lack of really good organizations that can receive funding. Why is this duplication happening? Guidelines, exactly like Denmark has already done, that need to be implemented. But I think when it comes to fighting anti-Semitism, to do it properly, you need to come up with a real definition of anti-Semitism so that you can start stamping it out. Going back to the details, I spoke about Lego, but there was also a detail about the lunar launch that was often overlooked. The SpaceX rocket that launched the Israeli lunar module had 2 deployments. It actually released, in addition to the Israeli module, it also released another satellite into orbit. These are details that I paid attention to because I like those little details. What were the 2 things? Why was it 2 satellites? Well, the Israeli lunar launcher will land on the moon on the 11th of April. But in addition, there was a communication satellite from Indonesia. Indonesia is the world's largest Muslim population country. It has officially no cooperation with Israel. There's no diplomatic ties between Israel and Indonesia. But for the purposes of bettering our countries, better communication, scientific discovery, scientists from our 2 countries worked together. They needed to know each other's, the payload specifications, scientific outlook. Scientists were working together in order to improve the lives of citizens in both countries, between 2 countries that have no official diplomatic relations. That is where real peace and cooperation starts. Encouraging people to work together. And I think that is where solutions will be found, when you encourage people to work together, rather than focus on the problems and the issues that draw them apart. Thank you very much for your time. Questions?